Okay. Okay, good evening and good morning and afternoon to some of you. You join us for the Global Energy Outlook Forum. We are now in the fourth section, if you like, of our 12-hour round the world tour, if you like, talking to the top 50 energy analysts in the energy markets for their outlook on the year ahead. And now we are in the Americas section, having been to Asia, Middle East and left Europe behind as well a couple of hours ago. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Rob Barnett, EMEA Lead of Energy and Commodity Research at Bloomberg, Bill Spindle, Senior Global Correspondent at Cipher News, and Richard Radolia, CEO of Matrix Global Holdings. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for joining us. And we are going to be tackling the question, will the real America please stand up? US oil and energy output hit records in the same year that the Inflation Reduction Act and COP28 published their statements as well. And so what's next for green Washington? And how do these two things in our headline there tally, and where are we going in our outlook towards 2024 and beyond? We did see US production reaching again a record high at the tail end of last year, surprising some. We've seen natural gas also set to rise going ahead in this year and next year, and LNG exports from the US. So we see, conventional oil and gas on the up, and we saw President Biden 3 years ago pledge to transition, as others did from at the COP28 meeting. But then we had Ukraine, prices spiked. And President Biden sort of perhaps did an 180-degree turn. Some would argue not, but things have got a little bit confusing since then. Richard, let me go to you first. How do these two things marry in terms of where the US is really going forward with its Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest bill on climate change in America, and at the same time continuing on the trajectory of oil and gas production?
Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate the time. I think you say confusing in Biden and energy policy in one sentence that explains the United States energy policy. It is confusing. It is difficult to determine which is the actual direction. The United States is split right down the middle. Right, we are a country of right and left, and on right and left, it has to do with the energy transition. The question I just posed to gentlemen on the panel with me who know more about the transition than I do. I'm a 40-year energy guy, oil guy, and so my biggest question is, when does reality actually hit? The special envoy John Kerry is not an elected cabinet official, right? He's calling for the doubling of the energy efficiency and the tripling of renewable energy, while he flies on his wife's private jet. So I have an issue that's going forward. That how does this happen? In my mind, it's almost mathematically unachievable. The Inflation Reduction Act is really an inflation act. It is. They've talked about $300 billion of spending. Goldman Sachs has come out and said it's going to be $1.2 trillion. That's because there's an unlimited amount of tax credits that are effectively going to go forward. It's government policy determining supply demand. And I tend to be kind of a libertarian capitalist. I believe that supply demand is a function of what people actually want and what they will buy. So I think what we're faced with here is the government is mandating through the EPA 60% of all new cars have to be electric. Electric cars are great. Rob has one. All my buddies have one. They drive fantastically. The problem is we only have sold 5.7% of electric cars last year, and the largest car companies are now cutting back on their 24 and 25 production forecast because they're losing around $34,000 to $35,000 a year if they're not Tesla. And so we're in this issue of what do you do? Do you subsidize losses? When you look at the car companies, the unions effectively are pushing against this because this is less workers for electric car. So in my mind, what we're faced with is a political reality. And I believe that while the Inflation Reduction Act is I tend to believe it's a climate change act because of all the different regulations that are going forward. We're seeing things that are difficult to get to. The government has now come out with $7.5 billion for fast chargers. That was granted 2 years ago. They're going to build 500,000 fast chargers across the country. To date, they built 2. So in my mind, and I think what I hope from the other gentleman on the panel is, how does this work? How do you actually get the megawatts needed to a location that's going to allow for this transition to occur? And that to me is the big question we have going forward.
Okay, thanks, Richard. No, I mean, as you're right, it is a climate change act. I mean, Inflation Reduction, I think many people have said it's a misleading name, and it's a very serious climate change act. The largest one ever passed anywhere, $360 billion of tax credits, loans, and basically to get the US economy going again, to sort of onshore supply chain, etc. Very serious things. Maybe that battery example you gave is not a success, but a lot of serious ventures being done, domestically and creating jobs, etc. Rob, let me go to you with that. I mean, one doesn't have to exclude the other necessarily. I think maybe what we'll conclude today, but is it confusing, and or does it make sense that Biden now is saying, okay, we do need a bit more oil and gas to keep going, please, for the next decade, but we are also very serious about this other side of the business. Where do you stand on that?
Good morning, good evening. So I think that this is going to be a hot button issue for the year. We are going into an election year. So I do think we're going to hear a lot about this topic. My own view is that we are really in this sort of interesting all of the above type world where you've got EVs growing relatively quickly in the aggregate, but oil demand still going up. You've got wind and solar demand growing very rapidly. In a good year, oil demand maybe grows 1%. Well, wind and solar demand is growing 20% plus a year right now. I mean, these kind of staggering numbers, very fast paced, but gas demand still going up, natural gas demand, coal demand, maybe it's plateaued globally, but flattish, maybe even up. So despite all of the efforts that we're seeing in the clean energy space, fossil fuel demand is still out there. I think last year we spent globally in excess of $1 trillion on clean energy. It was one of the first times that clean energy matched or exceeded all of the upstream oil and gas spending out there in the world. And again, emissions still rising. So I think it's an interesting time. And, we haven't gotten to the point where any of the spending on wind, solar, EVs, et cetera, has bent the curve down on any of the fossil fuels out there, which I think is what some of the policymakers are hoping for. And maybe it's on the horizon, but 2024 is probably not going to be the year where we see any material changes in kind of the fundamental demand equations for traditional fuels.
Okay, Bill, I mean, let's have your take on that. I mean, we are in an election year in America. We're going to see Biden and Trump campaigning for different things. Biden, how strong do you think he will be this time around on what he's not going to come out and promise anything on oil and gas, is he, in terms of, well, I'm not going to grant any more licenses like he said last time. He's clearly made that turnaround. So where do we stand on that from your point of view? I mean, the US is still one of the biggest emitters of the world. Is it going to try and continue to save that reputation by continuing to invest in the IRA Act with the incentives, or what? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, broadly, I think it's an energy transition. It's going to be intrinsically confusing and hard to sort out, particularly, as Rob says, right at this point of real, I want to say peak of the transition. I don't think we're really quite there yet, but the wheels are turning, and you can even see the oil and gas industry starting to adjust to a future that ultimately is going to see peaks in fossil fuels. That's so what we're seeing now is really a reflection of both the tensions and the opportunities in the U.S. political system as it moves into this era as a huge player on both stages, right? Oil and gas on the one hand, renewables and the IRA on the other. And that's going to be the landscape these candidates are going to be navigating, particularly Biden. The one big decision that we haven't pointed out so far is this big gas facility, LNG facility, which would be the largest in the world, I think, certainly the largest in the United States, the CP2. That still has to go up for approval, and that will be a really difficult decision that Biden's going to have to really balance these two things, where he's on the one hand doesn't want to crow about in any way supporting oil and gas, but on the other hand doesn't really want to cut those spigots off, certainly not completely, to say the least. Yeah. But he doesn't want to get blamed for any sort of a rise in petrol prices, or any sort of a shortage of and spike in, say, natural gas prices around the world or something. So to avoid that, he's going to have to weigh that against really stiff environmental resistance on that particular decision. So that's just one call, but it really shows the complex landscape he's going to be navigating this year.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly that it's supposedly U.S. production is what saved the day last year in terms of keeping a lid on prices. I mean, not just while OPEC was trying to raise them, the U.S. production came and kind of kept that under control. Richard, I mean, just looking at the sort of the IRA Act, the IR Act, it is a serious climate change act, serious investment, serious tax incentives, but it's also a very geopolitical move, isn't it? It's how important is it playing a part in terms of America's sort of reliance on parts, i.e. the China-America angle in principle, and really trying to sort of reverse the globalization trend that it at least set itself on a path. Do you think that is playing as much a part as any, incentive to actually do something about emissions and be seen to be? Oh, you're on mute, Richard. Sorry, you have to unmute.
There's some incongruities here as it relates to this transition. China, as I listened today with Clyde and Sean this morning, is massively expanding its EV base, right? So BYD is going to become the largest producer. It's doing it, and it's forecast to increase its coal production by 300 gigawatts over the next 6 years. So it's expanding its base. It has a rare earth metal advantage. It's now going to take those cars and sell them into Europe at a massive competitive discount, or competitive advantage. And so this $340 billion, you have to get rid of that. It's not $340 billion. It's 1.2, 1.5, 1.6 trillion, because the tax credits are unlimited. They go on and on and on. 1 gallon of biodiesel in California, 1 gallon has a $1.74 credit to it. Now that's a subsidy. It's an offset. That's $72 a barrel subsidy. So we're saying they're putting the money into it. The government doesn't create the money. It prints the money, or it taxes the money. So to me, it's an issue of how do we deal with this? Are we trading oil security in the Middle East now to China, which is a totalitarian communist government? That yes, that they're part of the world party, but they're also somewhat against, and they are a BRIC nation along with Saudi Arabia. So I have an issue with how we're going to do this. It seems to me very difficult, and I think Rob and Bill both said it. Nothing's going to happen in 24. We're not there yet. We're going to build a significant amount of solar and wind, but we're getting to that point where you're going to need other things to back up that solar and wind to allow for, constant total generation, right? It's a base generation you're still going to need. And what we're finding in India and in China, they're going to use coal power to push their transition, which to me is a little difficult to get your head around.
Yeah. Rob, I mean, tell us what your point of view is. Will we, whether if we get a Trump or a Biden presidency, that's one of the things that will happen this year, unfortunately, one way or another, but that's likely. And what difference will that make to the outlook for the oil and gas industry and, climate change investment? I mean, they're both probably running on similar pathways. That's the one thing they have in common, right?
Well, let's see how the campaigns unfold. I do think that we will see the IRA as a talking point. It could be similar to Obamacare. Now, if you recall, there was a lot of talk about repealing Obamacare, and the Congress never did it. So even if this is a hot button issue, and maybe different sides have different views on the trajectory of the country, getting Congress to act is a really difficult thing. I like to sort of think that each new president gets one or two wish list items that they get to do right away. Is repeal the IRA as opposed to do something grander really going to be the thing that any president would push for? And I have my doubts there. But that being said, this is really significant. And I think the IRA is not just in isolation. We also had, if you recall, there's this bill called the CHIPS Act, which is about bringing microprocessors into the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has really abandoned the era or the idea of free trade, and it's really engaging in all kinds of things and saying, not only does the U.S. want clean energy supply, but it wants the manufacturing to occur in the U.S. And so a number of the companies that we look at, First Solar is almost kind of a national champion of solar module manufacturers in the U.S. And they've got facilities under construction in Ohio and Alabama that are being built to explicitly take advantage of the subsidies for domestic manufacturing that are included within the IRA. And so if the IRA were to get paused or rolled back or anything like that, and a lot of companies are already deploying capital to really take advantage of it. So I think it would be a big blow to the companies that are out spending money to satisfy the requirements. And by the way, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and so forth, they're also taking action to take advantage of some of the subsidies within the IRA, maybe more on sort of the hydrogen, biofuel side, et cetera. But I think it is really changing the way that companies are thinking about investing in the U.S. And we've seen just tremendous amounts of dollars being spent to build clean energy supply chains within the U.S. so that it's not all over in China, as Richard was alluding to.
Yeah. And I mean, all the more reason why I think that's the one area where Trump and Biden would, I mean, he might want to repeal it because he doesn't want Biden's policy to have been a success, but Make America Great Again certainly fits the bill, doesn't it? Bill,
just jump in there.
Yeah,
if you don't mind if we just jump in and sort of extend that a little bit. I think, if the figures Richard's talking about of 1.2 trillion for the IRA were to actually come to pass, given the restrictions on domestic content, that would almost surely imply a massive ramp up in manufacturing of batteries and EVs in the United States, most of which are being built in factories that are going into the American South, generally red states. So, I think a Trump presidency would obviously have a very different flavor in many ways, but I'm not sure you'd see a complete abandonment of many of the IRA provisions because he's big on American manufacturing. And to the extent that the IRA is pouring money into American manufacturing, I doubt they're going to want to undo that.
Yeah, that would be my take anyway. Bill, and just to go one step further, so on this sort of US-China thing, not to focus on China too much as we're talking about the US, but from a trade point of view, from the CHIPS Act, etc., taking into account the whole China-Taiwan issue, which could flare up, hopefully not. How does China, not that you can speak for the Chinese, but how do you think China's viewing this? Having seen the IRA Act come in, from an EV, from a technology investment, can it match similar initiatives, do you think?
Well, I think China's got its own approach, both domestically and abroad. Domestically, it's sort of it doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's basically an all of the above, ramp up everything, not just coal, but fantastic sums of renewables are being built there. So given their demand and other resources, we'll see where it washes out domestically. Overseas, it's a trade issue basically for them. They absolutely dominate almost every aspect of clean energy, and have the ability to really undercut even pretty significant subsidies in Europe and stuff. As Richard was saying, you're going to see a lot of, they're going to try to find ways to get their product into both the US and European market in one form or another. And the US and European markets and governments are going to have to make tough choices about how fast they want things like EVs to take off. If they want general adoption, you're going to need lower cost cars. Who supplies those best? Probably China. So those are going to be really difficult choices that are going to speed of the energy transition and how fast that goes forward, particularly in the US and Europe.
Yeah, and whether US and Europe put further subsidies to try and remain competitive on that front, slowly but surely. There's the question we've got, which is the title of our session, really. But is the US a leader or a follower in tackling climate change as a result of what we've been discussing? Climate legislation's been passed. It's COP28 sort of push to commitments. Richard, is it a leader or a follower? I know sort of what camp you're in, but given the investments it's made, and let's just take a scenario where Trump does come back in with his sort of sway towards the oil and gas industry, what will it be viewed at going forward, do you think?
It will be a follower. If Trump comes in, I agree with both Rob and Bill. If money's being spent, and the 1.2 trillion was Goldman Sachs's view of what the cost was going to be. So this is a big investment bank's view. I think it'll be a follower. I think that we'll see more money go into the oil patch. It's policy over time, right? It's what does policy mean over time, and how does that affect, and how does it affect geopolitically? We canceled the Keystone Pipeline, which would have been 800,000 barrels a day of crude coming into the U.S. Gulf Coast, the most efficient refined capacity in the world. That would have been allowed to be blended with the new crude that was coming online. So there would have been this real kind of synergistic crude supply into the United States. Instead, that crude is now going to go through the Trans Mountain Pipeline, through the San Juan Islands, to inefficient refineries in China. So, you look at what's going on, and I think the U.S. government wants to be a leader. The EPA has blocked through the Clean Water Act, the Pebble Mine in Alaska, and through the Boundaries Waters Act, which is a canoeing act, the Twin Mine in Minnesota. So, in my mind, the issue that what the government is doing, when you listen to Buttigieg or John Kerry, I don't know if they've looked at the math. I don't know if they've actually looked at the math of what does this mean. And I agree with both Rob and Bill. We're seeing a significant increase in solar and wind. At what point does that hit a limit? At what point do you have only solar power or only wind power? I'm just going to I did a quick calculation. This I think is interesting. One corner in Los Angeles, so you take one corner where you have 4 gas stations. Those 4 gas stations are going to need 10 fast chargers at each station to supply the kind of gasoline that would be needed going forward. One fast charger produces 150 kilowatt hours of power. One home in California uses 1.5 kilowatt hours. So you're going to need 7 megawatts of power delivered to one corner in California, baseload power at all times, every day of the year, rain or shine. And so I understand, I've led my life in the energy business. We always figure things out. To me, it took 80 years to get here. We're trying to do this in the next 10. And I'm having a hard time getting my head around that.
Rob, would you agree with that? Or can we see technology obviously extrapolate, exponentially grow, if you like, as it always does? Would you be as pessimistic? I know you're the transition's happening, but the speed, what's the speed per scale, etc.?
Well, I think behavior is going to be really different as the world transitions. And so, I have a Tesla. I charge it at home, and I didn't even install a high voltage charger. I charge it on a 120 volt outlet. It's sufficient. I do most of my charging at home, so I don't care whether there's a station down the road.
Florida.
You do need the fast charging for road trips and that kind of thing. But one thing that comes to mind about the cost issue that you've been raising, that I think is profound. Let me give you a data point. So I already mentioned First Solar. Now they've got a backlog. They've contracted and already pre-sold all of the panels they're going to be manufacturing through 2026. They've locked in a price of about 30 cents a watt for those panels. Now, if you were to go on the market today and to buy panels from China, you're talking about 11 cents a watt. So the IRA for sure is affecting prices. And so sort of the philosophical question, I think, for US and manufacturing is, do we want to make this stuff in America? Yeah. And are we willing to accept that it's probably going to come in at a higher cost to the consumer than if we had simply made the equipment in China? And this is a very interesting philosophical debate, because Germany was early to the solar revolution. 10 years ago, they were going bananas out, putting lots of solar everywhere. And they developed a lot of the technology, and then they just said, China, here you go. You make it now. And so I think the US is sort of saying, well, we want to do it. And at least right now, this sort of seems to be, we want to make it, and we're willing to pay more to have the supply chain exist in America. Now, if that kind of differential exists, though, longer term, it's 10 cents in China, 30 cents in the US, are we willing to pay that kind of differential? And so eventually there might be a discussion about whether these things make sense. But yeah, I think for the foreseeable future, it's here.
Well, that comes down to energy security, doesn't it? It's the same thing. You pay anything if you want to secure energy, if you don't want to be reliant on, at the moment. I mean, we are seeing relations soften a bit between China and the US recently. We've seen a slight turnaround. Bill, just back to you. And again, it's just, make the investment, take the plunge, and for those reasons. Bill, just on this question of the session, which is, what direction is America going? Let's agree that it's going to continue on both pathways, oil and gas, and transition from that at the same time. But in terms of this question of Biden granting more licenses for oil and gas, he obviously in the last election he said he's not going to. Then he began to do a little bit of that. And then, do you think we'll see clarity on that going forward? Does it matter? Clearly he's going to do it if he wants to, right? Or if he has to.
Yeah, it's hard to look forward to what would happen after an election should, say, Biden be elected. But in this election year, it's going to be really excruciating, I think, politically, particularly this decision about the Kaohsiung Pass CP2 thing, because environmentalists and frankly, young people many young voters who were really disappointed with the Biden administration's decisions on this Willow project that Biden did approve, are going to be, again, very disappointed. And, there's only so many groups of voters he can lose that are, basically his natural supporters, but may be just less inspired to come out and vote. That could really make a difference. So, he's got to weigh these two things, and it's going to be really, really difficult.
Richard, who would you put your money on this year?
As far as who wins the election?
Yeah.
Oh, there's no bet there that's worth. I mean,
it's not worth it. But
I believe a Republican could win. What that who Republican is, I don't know who it'll be. I really don't. I think to the point that Bill just raised is right. I would argue that young voters' view of energy policy is not worth listening to, and this is nothing disrespectful to them. It's just I don't believe that they have the historical view of what drives energy policy and how it's going to work. We've already seen what's happened in Italy. We saw what happened in Argentina. We saw what happened in the Netherlands. The EU is up for vote this year, but we know the EU is not going to change. The EU is already basically it's going to push unyielding for renewables, and it's going to continue to write its own obituary for the industrial base of Europe. I would hope that the US believes that we need to take on a stronger stance towards hydrocarbons. I learned years and years ago about peak oil demand. I was a trader in the 80s. I was on Wall Street in oil in the 80s and 90s, and peak oil demand, or peak oil supply was the big thing. We are running out of oil. It's going to happen. And sure enough, 2008, we had the lowest production in the United States in 2008, 5.5 million barrels. It's been up straight up there. I'm not going to fall for peak oil demand. I'm just not going to do it. People can talk about it, but I've learned my lesson. Don't try to guess where the peak is going to be.
Okay, and clean it up as much as possible in the interim. Gentlemen, thank you. We saw our result there, which was 75% say the US is going to be a follower in terms of climate change leadership. So there you go. Not a great sign, but perhaps a realistic one. Bill Spindle, Richard Radolia, and Rob Barnett, thank you so much for joining us. And please do stay tuned in for the next couple of sessions on the Americas. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.